Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. It's a great pleasure to have Steve McCrone from AGLX, and he'll be talking about a new era for risk management. Look, I've worked with Steve for a while now. I've known him as a top risk manager, a creative thinker, brilliant mind for some years. And I'll just do a little bit of a bio about Steve if you don't know him or it's been a little while, and then we'll get into it. Look, Steve honed his risk management skills in the high consequence and unpredictable environment of bomb disposal during his time as an officer in the New Zealand Army. Sounds pretty dangerous, Steve. Following his military career, he has built a successful international consultancy business, AGLX, with a focus on reshaping how we approach strategy, innovation, and risk management. Steve works with organizations across the globe to challenge conventional wisdom and create risk management systems that allow them to be adaptive and resilient. His mission is to help organizations navigate dynamic and uncertain situations and equip their leadership with the tools to create and lead resilient and thriving organizations. I hand you over to Steve, and Steve, thank you very much.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Steve McCrone from AGLX. We specialise in helping organisations manage in complexity, and the lens by which we do that is strategy, risk, and innovation. So today the subject's going to be on risk, but I'll talk to you about how we integrate innovation and risk into strategy. A couple of people, when I said I was going to do this talk, asked me if I was going to do one of the old school whiteboard sessions that we kind of did a lot of during lockdown. Of course, I said no, it's too painful to set up, but really I was talked into it. So if you want to get the most out of today, then if you just pin my smiling face and the whiteboard, then you'll be able to see what I'm drawing. I'm not going to write any detail. I'm really just going to draw some pretty basic diagrams and really just talk to you guys. This will be recorded. The recording will be made available. And for those of you who are interested in a deeper dive with maybe some references and a little bit more additional material on the how-to, then we'll have a white paper available for download, and that'll be on our website. And we can also send that out to you guys if you're interested. In respect to questions, my colleague Doug will be monitoring the chat for questions, or you can feel free to come off mute and interrupt at any time. I tend to road test some of my ideas in front of an audience, just so it forces me to think them through, and this is one of those sessions. So agreeing with me is not a prerequisite for success. If you want to disagree or you have a question or a comment, then please feel free. I think we'll all benefit from more of a discussion, and obviously I will leave lots of time at the end of this session for questions and spend some time for those if you want to stick around. So if we're all happy, then I'll just kick off. So in terms of your experience of risk and risk management over your working careers, who here is working in a calm, comfortable, and stable environment that has been brought about by the profession of risk management? Anybody want to put a hand up? No, like none of us, right? So you've got to think about why that is the case. And I've been sort of thinking on this for quite a while and working with David and RiskNZ, working on strategy, working with clients. And I've come to the belief that the paradigm by which we are taught to manage risk is at odds with how we experience risk. And I think that needs to change if the risk industry is actually going to mature and grow and allow us to really accommodate the increasing rate of change, uncertainty, and complexity that we see. Okay, so I'm going to start there. And I'm going to define that a little bit right now by saying there are three ways that we kind of experience the world. And the first way is this idea that change is accelerating. And I'll put some references in this, but we're drawing from Stuart Kaufman's work on the adjacent possible for those of you who want to look at it. But basically what it says, and this is the first diagram for today, is that we have a number of things in the world, and we have some time on the x-axis. And for most of humanity, there weren't very many things in the world. Our ancestors had access to sticks, stones, animal hides, fibrous material from plants, wood, etc. So they couldn't really do much with it. So what we call the adjacent possibles, or the things that were possible through the recombination of those things, was actually quite small. And for most of humanity, the things that ate your ancestors would be the things that ate you. The things that you used to gather food and make shelter were the same things that your ancestors used to gather food and make shelter. So for you in those times, certainty was of high value. If you could be certain that tomorrow was going to be like today, then effectively you could prepare for it. So that brings us to today, where actually now the recombination of things is starting to take off in a what Kaufman calls a hyperbolic fashion. So as more things become real, or more things become adjacently possible, that creates the ability to recombine them into even more things. And as you can see, the slope of the curve suddenly increases. So if you think about even in just the last couple of years, the rate of change, or the rate of opportunity that things like AI have provided us, has been massively different to the rate of change that perhaps even our great-grandparents have seen. So the rate of change is changing, but humans as a species have evolved through this period where certainty was preferable to uncertainty. Certainty kept us safe, certainty kept us alive. We are now in a period of massive uncertainty, and from a cognitive perspective, we are not prepared for it. So those are the first two things. Change is changing, and humans seek certainty. And it is true that when humans are faced with uncertainty, they get nervous, they get stressed, they get tense. And what is also true is that people who learn to respond to those feelings typically outperform people who don't learn to respond or move away from those feelings. So in an organizational sense, if we learn as an organization to respond to uncertainty in a way that's positive, we harness that fear, the lack of confidence, we harness the stress, then we can create the conditions where the uncertainty becomes an advantage to us, and the seeking certainty becomes a disadvantage to our competitors. The third point I'll make is things are becoming more entangled. It wasn't too long ago that a lot of things that we now see as deeply interconnected were actually quite independent. So a good example from, say, an ad agency is agencies could send messages via different channels out to the public in a one-to-many format, and really the only way that they could get a response from that was a one-to-one. Now, when ad agencies send a message out into the big wide world, people are connected through social media. People can take that message, bend it to their own agenda, and feed it back. Poor decisions and bad advertisements can suddenly explode on social media and create real problems. The organization and the ad agency effectively lose control because the public are connected in a way that they didn't used to be. And this interconnectedness makes the system very responsive to change in a way that's non-linear. Small things can have massive consequences. We see the spread of computer viruses, human viruses, etc., happen really, really fast now because we're connected. The ship that gets stuck in the Suez Canal can have a massive cascading effect on global logistics because of the interconnectedness of manufacturers, transport, and production. So that's the third, I guess, feature of the world that means that the way that we've taught to respond to risk is now insufficient for the world that we're now seeing. Are we happy with this so far? Okay, so what that really means is we're shifting, for the mathematicians in the audience, is we're shifting from a Gaussian view to a Pareto view. And what that looks like, again on my graph, is this. In a Gaussian world, it's a bell curve, if you're familiar with the shape of it. And what that looks like, I'll draw half of it. It looks like this. So we have most of the information clustered around the mean, and we have very little observable information beyond about 3 standard deviations from the mean, which means that things out in this end of the Gaussian curve are so highly improbable that we can just ignore them. And the best example for that is human height. my height, which is, believe me, not very tall, is actually independent from your height. The fact that I'm quite short doesn't make you taller. But things like wealth distribution, which is where Pareto initially did his work, are interconnected. If I have $1, you can't have it. And if I invest that dollar, I can make a return on it, and you can't make a return on zero. And what that means is if I have lots of dollars, then my wealth will incrementally grow and yours will basically stay the same. So in the world, we have very few mega wealthy people and a lot of people who are earning not very much. And what that looks like as we draw it is a Pareto curve. And it looks like this. And the feature it has is a very, very long tail. So if we think about a Pareto curve in respect to risk, then what we're seeing is a lot of the risks that we take or the risks that we face are deeply interconnected. A small change in one area of your risk profile will have changes in the other. A small change in one part of your business might have changes in another part of your business. So we need to shift away from this idea that the average matters. It's the stuff in the long tail that's going to provide opportunities for innovation, but also opportunities for extinction. If we get it wrong, it can have a massive effect. So we can now change this for frequency and this for consequence. Okay, so those of you who are used to likelihood consequence thinking, actually this is how I believe we should start drawing it. And if we can then start to chop the Pareto curve into different domains. So here in this part of it, if you can see, we have lots and lots of information of things that are quite frequent, almost certainly going to happen, but actually quite a low consequence. And we can deal with that in a pretty sort of clear way. We can just put barriers, guards, rules, etc. in place. So this stuff is probable. Here we have things about here that are possible. And these things have a diminishing frequency, but quite a high consequence. And they're things that might cause us a major loss of finance, a major people getting injured or hurt. We might have a big reputational damage. We might be the victim of a data breach. We might have a product that's launched that doesn't meet requirements. We have to do a recall. We might have a product that actually kills a few people and we have to backtrack on it. We might have a financial product that is being sold in a way that is unethical, for instance, and we might get into real trouble here. In this domain, most organizations revert to or use things like scenario planning. They use Monte Carlo analysis on the system. They hope generally that these things happen to other people and then they learn from it. So most of the people here who have an IT strategy, your security will be dependent on other people having been hacked and then you saying, well, what would we do if that happened to us? Okay, so you have a lot of earthquakes in that space, big earthquakes. How can we construct a building so that the next big earthquake doesn't topple it, et cetera, et cetera. But what that requires is prior information or the human ability to imagine what the future is going to be like and then prepare for that future. One of the problems in this space is that the preparation, because the consequence is quite high, tends to be quite expensive. And organizations kind of labor the point in terms of prioritization about how much they're going to spend to make their IT systems really secure versus how much they it might cost them if they were breached. So there's kind of a conundrum as we get across to this point. Are you all following me so far? Okay, but here's the problem. There's actually, in a highly interconnected, fast-changing world, this tail is really long. There's a whole lot of stuff happening under here. And these are things that have a very, very low, even zero frequency, i.e. it's never happened before, but it might happen in the future. And this is the plausible domain. It's plausible, but actually it might not even be possible right now. A few things might need to change in order to make it adjacently possible. But as we saw before, the domain of the adjacent possible is increasing hyperbolic or more than exponentially. So some of these things may happen to you, and if they do, they have a very high consequence. We don't know what could happen. We don't even know if it'll happen. But because the area under this part of the curve is so large, we know something will happen. So just hold that in mind. Something is going to happen that is going to disrupt your strategy, and you don't know what it is. Right, so for most organizations, we have a very solid line here in time or in terms of consequence, and we say everything on this side of the line is a crisis. And we have crisis management teams, we have backups, we have all sorts of things to shift us away from the chaotic state that crisis may cause. But the problem with that approach is that we're seeing crises more often. We're lurching into crisis more and more often, and because of the interconnectedness, then these crises tend to be larger. The next global financial crisis will almost certainly be larger than the last one. The next big flood event that you see in your area will almost certainly be larger than the last biggest flood event that you see. These things are increasing in their consequence because of the interconnectedness, because of things like climate change, which again is a problem of interconnected issues. So organizations who succeed, or successful organizations of the future, are going to be the people who learn to shift that line and make engaging in the plausible part of their everyday business. It's not to say that major crisis type events will happen every day, but actually if we increase our ability to deal with them as they emerge, rather than rushing into a sort of addicted to response, was the words that I heard at the conference, the New Zealand Risk Conference, which I thought were a really good statement. Rather than rushing into response mode, we can actually quickly activate our organization to explore, learn, and adapt to the new reality that this causes. And organizations who can do that quickly will outperform organizations who get stuck in a predict, plan, and control mode of risk management. Right, so that's the intro. But there is a way out, right? But the big problem for me is really is the ISO definition of risk, as risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, which actually forces us to think of risk in this space. It's actually a pretty good definition if all you had was the possible and probable domains of risk. Because in that space, you can form legitimate, clear objectives, and then you can use risk management to keep those objectives safe from uncertainty, or use uncertainty to kind of propel your direction towards those objectives. But actually, it's no good in here. And I should just show you why that is. And I'm going to go to the AGLX adaptive strategy methodology here. So the big assumption in the ISO definition of risk is that objectives-based planning is a useful way to formulate strategy in an organization. With increasing uncertainty, we don't believe it is. So very quickly, and I know a lot of you people have seen this before, this is available on our website or anywhere that we kind of talk about stuff, is we have change over time. Traditional strategy or objectives-based strategy teaches us to define where we are. So this isn't, there it is. Define where we are, define where we want to be. This is a place generally where all of our opportunities are brought to fruition, all of our problems are solved. And then we connect this idealized future to the present by virtue of a strategic plan. Okay, we might have some near-term objectives here, and we've got some far-term objectives here. Okay, but this relies on the assumption, and I think, from the early part of this talk, I think that's a very testable assumption, that we can control or at least predict the change in both the near and sort of medium-term future, if that's a 3 to 5 year period. Well, it turns out, and I'm guessing from an experiential perspective, most organizations can't do that. And the way to test that is to ask the question, show me 3 or 5 years ago the strategy that got you to here. Most organizations would struggle to do that. Most organizations formulate a strategy and then very quickly realize that their path has changed and they need to recast it. And we spend a lot of time and energy redefining or redetermining our objectives. And then by virtue of that, then your risk management is kind of catching up. If we're changing our objectives, we need to change our view on risk. The worst thing that can happen in this space is that our risk management, because we don't want uncertainty impacting our objectives, actually, we then use risk management to kind of lock in our objectives in a way where anything or anyone or any project or any idea that is counter to this path or this objective gets filtered out by the risk management people. They become kind of gatekeepers to innovation. Anything that's creative or different or can push us to a new adjacent possible gets filtered out. And then if this objective turns out to be not the right one or leading us in the wrong direction, then risk management is actually served to create the conditions where we're suffering strategic drift or suffering greater systemic risk. So by managing the small things around our objectives, we create bigger issues for the organization. So I think we should, frankly, stop using that definition. And I know you're all probably very polite. There'll be people who fundamentally disagree with that, and I'm absolutely happy to have that discussion. What I think we should do is create a new definition of risk, and I'd like to propose one. Risk is the difference between change and adaptive capacity. Okay, and that definition comes from really an ecological view where organisms that cannot adapt as things change become extinct. Organizations that can adapt get to shift to a new reality and create value inside that new system, but they're also prepared for it to change. And that comes with some problems of efficiency and some problems of distributed decision-making, which we'll get to. If you think about ecosystems on islands, like New Zealand's a good example, then the ecosystem optimizes itself for the local conditions. Okay, we have humans that come to this island, and with them they bring rats, etc. And later on they brought stoats and ferrets. The organisms that optimize for New Zealand conditions without those rats and stoats and ferrets, etc., quickly become extinct because they cannot adapt. So risk for them is a difference between the rate of change and their ability to adapt. So that brings us to an adaptive strategy. And again, I'll just go through it pretty quickly. We define our current state. We know it's messy. We know there's things we don't like. We know there's things that aren't working. We then define a very clear direction of travel. In which direction do we want to move from a strategic standpoint? Once we have a direction of travel, we can say, well, this is the main effort. These are the things we're going to focus on because this is the things that we have core competency from and that we can leverage into a new adjacent possible. Together, we call these things a shared understanding of success. And they define a direction and they define the main effort. And then the organization can experiment and explore across a broad range. So diversity is very important. Some of those experiments or ideas will be useful to us or provide value, others won't. So we need to constantly learn. We need to have a fast feedback mechanism. As we learn, we can put more resources into things that we're becoming more confident in. As long as we're moving in the right direction at the right tempo, then adaptive strategy allows us to maximize our potential, maximize our ability to confront a fast-changing world because we're constantly experimenting and exploring. And what we find here is the path becomes an emergent property of the strategy. We don't plan it in advance and then try and protect it with risk management. Risk management now is a function of rapid exploration, learning, amplifying the things that are working and shifting away from the things that aren't. So we take small risks in order to avoid strategic risk or strategic irrelevance. We're constantly exploring and failing in order to find the things that are going to work for us. And again, that mimics an evolutionary approach or a biological approach to strategy, as opposed to the mechanical or the sort of path approach that is used across most organizations. And we work with a lot of organizations to kind of implement this stuff.
Steve,
Sorry, Doug.
We've just got a question in the
Yes.
chat. That this might be a good spot to ask it. It's
Great.
Ben is saying, how would this fit in with the classical operational risk, such as health and safety?
Yeah, so
that's
that
a really,
was talking to your definition.
yeah,
because I like it, and what you're saying is great. But yeah, I was like, oh, how would that fit in?
Yeah, we actually do a reasonable amount of work in health and safety, and the adaptive approach is quite useful, because what we can do, if I go back, it's probably better to explain it using the Pareto, this is the safety curve, and these are the things that are going to kill you. Very low probability of them happening in most organizations, mostly because people aren't stupid, and secondly because we've had enough killed people that we sort of understand. Is that sort of true? Frequency now. Okay. These are the things that might hurt you. So cut fingers, you know, bumps, scrapes, whatever. Okay. If we know that something in here can kill you, we can put a guard on a machine, we can put a physical barrier in place. So we can actually use a pretty traditional risk management approach, identify the risks, you know, mitigate them by various controls, yeah? And that's pretty good stuff. In a safety sense, we might say, actually, there are other things like, you know, extreme weather events might affect a construction site. You know, a massive power surge, etc., might affect people in a safety context, and we can guard against that by having isolation, by having you know, engineering solutions that hold our scaffolding up in the storms, by turning our cranes into the wind and getting off them, etc. So we've got that here. In this space here, these are the things that we just weren't aware of, that didn't even come across our radar, and suddenly things line up in a way, this might be the Swiss cheese idea, where someone gets seriously injured or hurt. And what we want to do with adaptive capacity in that respect is, how do you increase the sensitivity of your workforce to conditions that are starting to change in a way that hasn't been seen before? And then what do they do when they see them? And if you've done a number of accident investigations, which I have, you'll often hear people say, and I've been talking to the health and safety people at Pike River, where they say, this was an accident waiting to happen. And that is a quote from one of their safety people 2 years before the explosion. Why? Because people are talking about safety in a way that tells us that our formal safety program is not having the effect that we thought it had. There's too much other stuff going on, and that's creating pressure on the system that'll eventually break. So what we do in safety is we're increasing our sensitivity to the small things that might give us a clue to when the system is going to suddenly shift, or when the system's not operating the way that our official channels work. Take that back to risk. Actually, we've got a risk management process here that seems to be working and mitigating all the known and knowable risks. How do we increase our sensitivity to the strategic environment so that we can explore and experiment and test the emerging risks, the stuff that we're not thinking about? So you can actually substitute everything I've said right up until now with the word safety, and it would still hold true. Actually, quality is another word that you could substitute. We're doing some work in quality, and again, you can engineer quality into your system in this period. Here we have to use an adaptive approach to continuously put pressure on the system to produce better quality. That answer your question?
Steve?
Yes.
Can I just sort of test that against some like real life examples in that kind of operational safety, health and safety space? So the way I'm thinking about it is from like a technology or activity kind of viewpoint. So in industry or whatever, new technologies are discovered. And quite often they provide a really good solution. So a couple of really good examples spring to mind, asbestos and like engineering stone. When both of them were discovered, they were provided an awesome solution and, arguably still do, but come with risks associated with them that nobody was aware of until years later.
Yes.
Now this principle comes into play when people become aware of the issues and can actually adapt to that to find an alternative.
Yeah. So
The faster they can adapt to find an alternative, the more that they can mitigate that risk. Is that kind of what you're alluding to? And you
yeah,
can
that's what
apply
I'm
the same
saying.
principle to
Um,
like an activity, like building skyscrapers without scaffolding or
yeah,
safety harnesses or something like
yeah,
that, if people
yeah,
kept falling
yeah,
off them. So
yeah.
yeah,
With the I'll go back to Pareto. With asbestos, and I'm assuming you're talking about the silicate
yeah,
idea with cutting stone.
yeah,
Yeah, it's kind of the new asbestos.
yeah,
Yeah, and what's the new one, right? Well, when people first started using asbestos, for instance, they didn't have enough knowledge of the system to understand that breathing in the dust was really bad. It's carcinogenic. So that risk is actually sitting out here. It's unknown, unknowable, and arguably some people should have known, but they didn't. But once they started to see the evidence, then you're going to shift the system rapidly this way, and now we're going to deal with it as almost it's a very well known thing now. If you're working with or disposing of asbestos, there are some very, very clear safety guidelines that you must follow in order to keep you and your staff safe and the general public. So that's an example of something that was first detected out on the periphery of our understanding, and then quickly through building up evidence, both medical, etc., and then putting some real rules and regulations around it, it's very quickly become something that is very easy to deal with now, or it should at least be relatively easy to deal with. And silicate, this dust from cutting stone has gone through that same process and faster because we've got precedent. But there are still things lurking out here that are hurting people that we're not dealing with. Organizations that can rapidly detect and respond to those are going to be more successful than organizations that can't. And they're not just bad things, right? These are opportunities. Within all of this stuff, there are opportunities for success. So if you're a company that can very quickly find a way to cut stone in a way that's safe, then you will outcompete a competitor who is optimized for cutting stone in a way that's unsafe. The way to do that is this idea of creating resilience. So this is really where we're heading now. We're talking about resilient organizations that have the adaptive capacity to change in the face of a fast changing environment. And in order to do that, so we've got this adaptive strategy, which in my view creates a enabling infrastructure for distributed decision-making and distributed leadership. We're now starting to understand diversity from a strategic perspective. It's not just desirable, it's not nice. It's absolutely fundamental to the idea of being adaptive. The more points of view, the more we can harness what we call creative friction, the more that we can utilize people who will look at the same information from a different perspective. We have a broader way of experimenting. We have a broader way of thinking about what might be possible in the future. And the last one there is this idea of harnessing what I call playful curiosity. Organizations get very, very serious around risk. They get very, very serious around efficiency, and they rob people of their ability to just be curious. And I take my cue there from when I was in the army, and we were literally playing with explosives to see how many ways we could, you know, cut through something without destroying it, or how many ways we could hide an explosive somewhere that might kill someone, and therefore we increasing our sensitivity to people who might do that, you know, bad actors, etc. But you have to be very curious and very playful in that sense. So we developed the ICE innovation framework in order to allow organizations or show them how to shift energy to that sort of curious side. And I'll just quickly go through that because it's an enabler for adaptation, and it's a really good way of bringing risk and innovation together. And we say, you know, innovation is the outcome of a way of working. It's not an input. It's not something you can sort of sprinkle across the organization in order to change it. It's an emergent property of the way we work. Okay, and it's the definition, and I think my colleague Doug, innovation is the successful amplification of experimentation. Okay, it's an outcome of those two things. The amplification process, i.e. putting energy into something that's working, and experimentation about taking a more playful approach at looking at strategic environment and finding areas of value. And it looks like this is pretty basic stuff. And again, this is something we said you want to see it. It's about the only thing we've trademarked. ICE. So intelligence, curiosity, execution. Execution as getting things done. Most organizations, particularly if they're in a very objectives-based planning, you know, the effective uncertainty on those objectives from a risk perspective, get very much into the intelligence execution. So this is where we get very analytical, we get very data-driven, we get very pragmatic in respect to getting things done. So only projects and plans that have a very clear, tangible, analytical, categorical benefit get funded. Those that we say we're just exploring tend to not get funded. We're rigidly determined to be efficient and effective. And we kind of get stuck in this space. This is the space of pragmatism. Nothing wrong with pragmatism, but pragmatism is not going to shift some of the existential risks that organizations are facing. All right, and I'm going to say that again because I get people nod and they, yeah, that's true. Pragmatism is not going to shift the exponential risks that organizations are facing. So if you see it as a problem to solve, and then you think you're going to get enough data or expertise in order to find that solution, you are wrong. Okay, you need to explore, we need to innovate, we need to be more adaptive. If we're here and we're just curious and we can execute, and we're sort of like the mad scientists, we're coming up with ideas, but they don't really fit any kind of strategic intent or the main effort or our internal capability. They're not adjacently possible to us. And you might, from time to time, find value here, but most of the time you just annoy people and waste resources. And if I look through the project list in a lot of these organizations and I say, which projects are annoying people and wasting resources, I bet I get a big long list. So here's some advice. Kill those things. They're not working. Okay, if they're not working now, they may not work. Okay, if we're intelligent and curious but can't execute, that's actually a nice place to start because it's kind of like being free of constraint. We can really get imaginative here. You know, this is the domain of science fiction for the most part. It's just fun to sort of let go of reality and play in a new world for a while. If that remains the case, then people do get frustrated and a bit disappointed and you kind of look at it as you're a bit crazy. But actually, it's a nice place to start. It's a very free place. You want to do playful curiosity, you start in that space. What we want to do is we want to say, okay, let's use our intelligence to get a clear picture of where we are, the direction we're going to head, and the main effort. Okay, so that's in this domain. And this is where leaders get to make a call. No, we're not going that way. We're going this way. Right? Strategy is not a democracy. And then risk becomes saying, okay, if we are heading in that direction, how can we be a little bit curious about how to do it? How can we be a little bit curious about our core business and say, well, what would we be like if this thing wasn't there anymore, if this thing failed? What would we be like if we weren't manufacturing petrol engines anymore, what would we look like? What would we, AGLX, look like if we didn't do any work in New Zealand? Oh, actually, we might look like we have a good relationship with people in the US. We might look like we have a business in Singapore or Australia. It's not that we're not going to work in New Zealand, but actually we're starting to think more broadly about our business. What would happen if your core business was suddenly attacked by a major competitor? How could you make that a beneficial outcome for you? This is curiosity. When we did some work with water care, and this is in the case study, we called it the bigger pipes problem. If you give an increasingly dense city and a spread out city to a bunch of water engineers, and they're intelligent and they're good at getting stuff done, then they just build bigger pipes. So we use curiosity to say, how can we create the conditions where we don't need bigger pipes, where we can get this thing done without having to replicate the infrastructure? Okay, and then what we're doing is we're bringing the energy into the middle here. We're saying, let's base our curiosity on something that's tangibly important to us, and then let's execute in a way that's not all in. So we're not looking for big projects here in the first instance. What we want to do is bring our execution, lower the energy needed to explore, and get into a mode of operation where we can quickly test an idea, learn from it, put energy into it and amplify it if it's working, shift away from it if it's not. And this becomes, this ICE innovation, or this process becomes a risk management tool for your strategy. What would we see if we were wrong, and are we looking for it? Okay, and then we can engage our curiosity, and then that brings us back to this idea of being able to deal in the long tail of the Pareto. We're going to find things in here we weren't looking for, and they will help us become more adaptive in the future when things change. And we're shifting away from this idea of change of things like 3 horizons. If you look at the world today, Horizon 3, that used to be comfortably more than 10 years away, is tomorrow morning. It's already happened. It's just not evenly distributed yet. So we adopt a mode of operation where we can quickly engage with change, find sources of value, and then lean into them, rather than trying to fend change off with our risk management process. All right, I'll take a breath now. It's 1:45. I've basically gone through all the points that I wanted to make. I'll take questions or comments or anything else from the audience. Have we got anything coming in?
Steve, just while we're waiting, and look, please, anyone ask questions, now's the opportunity. Do you find it's difficult at times to get this across to organisations to look at risk in a different way like you do? And if you do, what do you think that is so?
Firstly, yes. I think the huge advantage for most New Zealand organisations is they're not terribly good at managing risk in the traditional sense. So let's actually just leapfrog it and take an adaptive approach. And it's typically what they do anyway. Like they've got smart people reacting in the moment to things that are changing. Like harness that. It's already happening in your organisation. So in some ways, it's actually easier for organisations that haven't established really formal, rigid risk management processes. But other organisations that have, we just simply ask them questions like, when was the last time something happened that was surprising to you from a strategic standpoint? How far out, like what is the limit of your predictive capacity? And for most organizations, you can show that that limit is pretty near term. There might have been a time when they were fooling themselves into thinking it was 3 to 5 years. It's 6 months now at best. So holding on to doing the wrong thing more often doesn't make it the right thing. And we say, actually, if you want to move away from that, maybe you could try something new and try it in a way that's safe to fail. We don't have to adopt this thing wholesale. We don't have to throw everything else out that we've done. Traditional approaches still work in the possible and plausible. Don't throw them out. People get hurt or things go bad, but there's more to it. There's actually another dimension to risk that's missing.
We've got a question from Gavin asking, what are your thoughts on the 3 lines of defense model?
Oh, yeah, might have to explain that to the group, Gavin, if you can. Being me. I'm not familiar with it enough to talk about it knowingly here.
Can you hear me, Steve?
Yeah, I can, mate. How you
Oh,
doing?
yep. It was developed by the International Institute of Internal Auditors or something, and it talks about the first line being the business, the second line being risk and compliance, and the third line being internal audit, and different roles and responsibilities as it relates to risk and control. First line implementing the risks, the controls and processes, second line challenging that, and third line the independent review of controls.
Yeah. So again, that takes the format of, plan, predict, control, where that sounds like really good to me for risks that are known or at least knowable. It doesn't sound like it would be much use for risks that are in that long tail. What happens with those kind of methods where we say, oh, we're going to put a program in place based on our understanding of the risk landscape. So spend a lot of time understanding the risk landscape that's already changed by the time you've understood it. And then we put all the controls in place, and then we audit those based on effectively the same thing. It kind of creates rigidity, and really, and it creates this feeling of certainty. Remember, humans are seeking certainty, so we feel comfortable and in control. And what we've effectively done there is ignored the real risk landscape. So we get the tick on the board report, but actually the risks are still there. The long tail risks are still there, and we haven't adapted or developed the adaptive capacity we need to address them. So do those things, but don't think that's enough. The point here is it's not enough. It never really was, but it's becoming increasingly less utility to those methods. I see a bunch of questions, Doug.
Yep. How about risk appetite? Any views on this concept?
Yeah, I've typically had a pretty dim view. I've said it's like appetite to me kind of reminds me of when we go out to dinner and you look at the menu and decide which items you're going to consume and decide which items you're not, obviously. I think for most organizations, risk is being more like a foie gras duck, where they're throwing the food down you regardless of whether or not you want it. So expressing an appetite in a lot of places is kind of it's kind of like a wish list. You've actually got to say, let's explore the risk landscape, and let's first understand where we can actually intervene in a way that has real impact. So a lot of the risks that we face, particularly in the long tail, we don't have a choice. So the key there is when we do this work, we do a lot of risk appetite work now, believe it or not, is we actually start to surface risks, not as tell me what your appetite is. It's saying, oh, this is a risk, and it's a tension. The risk is expressed as a tension, so a virtue and absence and a virtue and excess. Where do you think we are? So you ask people individually on that tension line, and then where do you think we should be? And oftentimes you'll start to see a lot of disparity, particularly at a board level, of where people think we are and where they think we should be. And then the discussion doesn't become what's the risk appetite, it becomes why do you think this when someone else thinks that? And why do you think we should be here when other people think we should be here? And it's actually the discussion that adds value, because in that discussion, we're showing the difference in the tension, but we're also creating a more situational awareness that risk is not seen the same way by the same people. And that increases, believe it or not, adaptive capacity. And then we can turn those into statements. This is how we manage the tension in this place, not we want to be here. No, that's an objectives-based kind of wish list. Doesn't work.
We've got another question from Rodney. Given the limitations of predicting exact future events, what role do you see scenario planning playing in helping organizations stay agile, and how might it differ from traditional enterprise risk management?
Yeah, so those of you familiar with scenarios, I always say they're a bit like cargo pants. They're very popular in the 90s. And it's sort of coming back, which is surprising to me, because it didn't really work then, believe it or not. And I did a bit of that stuff. I was trained in futures. So scenarios is like saying we're here now, and the future cone of possible, plausible, probable. We want to create scenarios about what the future could be, okay, in respect to time, and say, let's actually prepare ourselves for something that's like really good or really bad or probable. There's so much embedded assumptions in this model that it's interesting from a cognitive perspective. It doesn't actually add a lot of value. It's interesting in actually road testing or stress testing a strategy. Did that strategy stand this scenario? If it can't, it's not adaptive enough. Let's increase the adaptive capacity of the strategy, not change it to meet that scenario. So that's about the only time we use it. The big risk with using scenarios is they blind us to the things that might happen here outside of our, long tail of the Pareto, outside of our understanding, unknown unknowns. And the other problem with scenarios is you do not have, in this fast changing time, the luxury of time. This scenario might have happened yesterday and you don't know it yet. So you have to increase your adaptive capacity in respect to multiple potential futures, none of which are knowable to you. It's a complex adaptive system. If you said with certainty, the price of oil or interest rates is going to be at this point at this time T, the market would shift and this price would happen tomorrow. So scenarios, in my view, are quite limited utility. Increase your adaptive capacity in the face of any potential scenario.
Righto. Final question from Ben. How would you best see organizations ensuring that they keep a focus on these strategic risks? Any practical examples?
Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of tools and techniques that we use. One of my favorites is it's a method developed by Gary Klein called the pre-mortem, where you say, we're planning, yeah, you can Google this, of course. We're planning to do this thing that's going to get us to here in 3 years or 2 years or a project. It was a complete failure. What went wrong? And then the organization or the people in the organization or the team start to think about what went wrong, and then we discuss it. And then what we're doing is we're increasing our sensitivity to falling off the track, and then saying, what are we going to do if we see those weak signals? So that's one technique that we use that's in a broader categorization of what I call strategic sensitivity, which is how do you create a mechanism, and the Pike River example I used before was another example. How do you create a mechanism where this informal, unofficial feedback gets to the point where people can actually react to it? So a mechanism in your organization for fast feedback based on, this is our direction of travel. If we see anything that might impact on our ability to shift in that direction, how do we get to the point where we can hear that? And there'll be lots of different informal networks we can put in place. We use what we call naturalized sense making. So gathering narratives and looking for patterns in the narrative. We use pre-mortems. We use a process called the future backwards, etc. And we're just increasing people's sensitivity to change in trajectory.
Would you like to make some closing comments, Steve, and then we'll hand it back to David?
I think I've heard enough from me. Thank you all for your time. Like I say, agreeing with me is not a prerequisite for success, so very keen to hear your feedback. We will send you the white paper, which is a little bit more coherent than my kind of ramblings and drawings on the board. Yeah, any other questions, always open to have a bit of dialogue, always keen to get, hear from you guys in respect to your experiences with using or not using some of this stuff. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate you taking your lunch out to listen to me. Cheers.
And thank you, Steve, from Mission New Zealand and all the members. Thanks everyone who came today. Fantastic questions. And this is what we're doing into next year, is more interactive sessions, more engagement, people getting involved. And I think that's really getting a lot of value. And thanks, Steve, from your approach. It makes sense. It makes it much easier to understand. It's articulate. And I think it's something we're really missing in a lot of risk management. So thank you for your time today.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.